November 8, 1944, 11:17 at night, the Scheldt Estuary, Netherlands. The sound was the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun firing at maximum depression. But the tracers were not arcing skyward toward German aircraft. They were slicing horizontally across flooded polders, tearing through the stone walls of a Dutch farmhouse 300 yards distant. Inside that farmhouse, a German machine gun team had been pinning down a platoon of Canadian infantry for 2 hours. Artillery could not reach them. The flooded terrain made flanking impossible. Mortar fire had proven ineffective against the thick stone walls. And then Corporal James MacDonald of the Canadian Artillery had an idea that would have horrified his training instructors, but would save the lives of 32 Canadian soldiers. He ordered his Bofors crew to depress the barrel to near horizontal, aim at the farmhouse, and fire. The gun was designed to shoot down aircraft at high angles. It was never intended for direct ground support, but MacDonald had spent 2 months in the Scheldt, watching Canadians die in flooded terrain where conventional weapons could not reach German positions, and he had noticed something about the Bofors that nobody else had considered. It fired explosive shells. It had a high rate of fire. It was mobile enough to be positioned close to the front lines, and it could be aimed at ground targets if you were willing to violate every regulation in the book. The first burst of 10 rounds hit the farmhouse wall. The explosive 40mm shells, designed to destroy aircraft fuselages, punched through centuries-old stone like it was cardboard. The second burst hit the window where the German machine gun was positioned. The third burst hit the same window from a slightly different angle. After 30 seconds of sustained fire, the farmhouse wall collapsed inward. The German machine gun fell silent. The Canadian infantry advanced. They found 3 dead German soldiers and a weapon emplaced in a position that should have been impregnable to anything except heavy artillery. Corporal MacDonald had just discovered a tactical innovation that would spread through the Canadian Army like wildfire. Over the next 6 months, Canadian forces would use the Bofors 40mm gun in ways its Swedish designers never imagined, and in ways that would horrify Allied doctrine writers. They would use it as direct fire artillery. They would use it as bunker-busting weapon. They would mount it on landing craft. They would use it to suppress entire villages. They would turn an anti-aircraft gun into one of the most feared ground support weapons on the Western Front. This is not a story about a gun. This is a story about how Canadians, facing impossible tactical problems in terrain that negated conventional weapons, looked at the equipment they had and asked not, "What is this designed for?" but "What else can we do with this?" This is the story of Canada's unusual use of the Bofors 40mm in World War II. And it is a story about innovation born from necessity, about soldiers who rewrote doctrine in the field, and about how a weapon designed to shoot down Stukas ended up demolishing German defensive positions from the Scheldt to the Rhine. To understand why Canadians used the Bofors 40mm in such unconventional ways, you must first understand what the weapon was designed to do. The Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun was a Swedish design developed in the 1930s. It was one of the finest anti-aircraft weapons of its era. The gun fired a 40mm high-explosive shell at a rate of 120 rounds per minute. It had an effective ceiling of 12,000 feet. It was accurate, reliable, and simple to operate. Most importantly, it could be produced in large quantities relatively cheaply. By 1944, the Bofors was the standard light anti-aircraft gun for Allied forces. Every infantry division had them. Every naval vessel larger than a frigate mounted them. Every airfield was protected by them. The Canadians received hundreds of Bofors guns through Lend-Lease from the United States and through direct purchase from Sweden before the war closed that option. Canadian factories in Montreal also produced Bofors guns under license. By the time of the Normandy invasion, the Canadian Army had more Bofors guns per division than most other Allied forces. But there was a problem. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was largely absent from the skies over Western Europe. German aircraft rarely appeared over Canadian positions. The Bofors crews, trained extensively to shoot down aircraft, were sitting idle while infantry struggled to overcome German defensive positions. The Canadian tactical situation in autumn 1944 created unique challenges that exposed the limitations of conventional weapons. After breaking out of Normandy, Canadian forces were assigned the mission of clearing the approaches to Antwerp. This meant fighting through the Scheldt Estuary, a landscape of flooded polders, dikes, canals, and fortified villages. The terrain was a nightmare for attackers. Movement was restricted to narrow dikes and causeways that could be swept by German machine guns. Flanking maneuvers were impossible in many areas because the land was flooded. Artillery fire, while devastating in open country, was less effective against German positions built into the thick-walled buildings of medieval Dutch villages. Tanks often could not reach German positions or bogged down in the mud when they tried. Canadian infantry was dying in large numbers trying to assault positions that could not be effectively suppressed with available weapons. It was in this context that the first instances of unconventional Bofors use began. The exact origin is disputed. Multiple Canadian units claim to have independently discovered that the Bofors could be used against ground targets, but all accounts agree that it began as improvisation by junior officers and NCOs who were desperate to find ways to support their infantry. The first documented use of a Bofors in a ground support role occurred on October 23, 1944, near the village of Woensdrecht. A platoon of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry was pinned down by German machine guns firing from a brick factory building. The building's thick walls resisted rifle grenades and mortar fire. The company commander radioed for artillery support, but the artillery liaison officer reported that they could not risk firing on a target so close to Canadian positions. The infantry was stuck. Then, Lieutenant Robert Chen, commanding a Bofors anti-aircraft section positioned 500 yards behind the front line, heard the situation over the radio net. Chen was a Chinese-Canadian from Vancouver who had joined the Army in 1941. He had been trained as an anti-aircraft gunner and had spent months in England waiting for German aircraft that never came. Now, he was in the Netherlands watching infantry die while his guns sat silent. Chen studied the tactical problem through his binoculars. The German machine guns were firing from windows on the second floor of the factory building. The building was 600 yards from his position. His Bofors gun had an effective range of 5 miles against aircraft. 600 yards was point-blank range. Chen called his gun crew together. "We are going to fire at that building." His gunner, Bombardier William Moss, looked confused. "Sir, that is a ground target. We are anti-aircraft." Chen nodded. "I'm aware of our designation, but there are no aircraft to shoot at, and there are Germans in that building killing our infantry. We have a gun. We have ammunition. We are going to use it." Moss considered this. "Sir, the manual says the Bofors is not to be used in direct fire role against ground targets. The barrel elevation mechanisms are designed for high-angle fire." Chen's response was brief. "The manual was written by people who are not here. We are here. Depress the barrel as far as it will go. Aim at the second-story windows. Fire when ready." The gun crew set to work. The Bofors was mounted on a four-wheeled carriage that could be positioned easily. They rolled it forward to a hull-down position behind a small rise. They depressed the barrel to approximately 10 degrees above horizontal, the lowest angle the mounting would allow. They loaded a clip of 4 rounds. Moss aimed carefully at the factory building's second floor. At Chen's command, he pressed the firing pedal. The Bofors barked 4 times in rapid succession. 4 40mm high-explosive shells crossed 600 yards in less than 2 seconds. 2 shells hit the brick wall around the window. 2 shells went through the window opening. The result was dramatic. The 40mm shells, designed to destroy aircraft, were overkill against a brick wall. The explosive force blew chunks of brick and mortar inward. The shells that penetrated the window exploded inside the room where the German machine gun was positioned. The effect on the German crew was catastrophic. Chen ordered continuous fire. His crew had 5 4-round clips immediately available, 20 rounds total. They fired all 20 rounds in approximately 10 seconds, walking the fire across the entire second floor of the factory building. When the firing stopped, the factory's second floor was a ruin. Windows were blown out, walls were holed, and the German machine guns had fallen silent. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry advanced and cleared the building. They found the remains of 2 German machine gun teams and a forward observer. The Bofors fire had not just suppressed them, it had obliterated them. Lieutenant Chen's radio crackled, the infantry company commander. "Whatever the hell you just did, thank you. That was the most effective fire support we have received in weeks. Can you do it again if we need it?" Chen replied affirmatively. And with that exchange, the Bofors gun had officially entered Canadian service as a ground support weapon. Word of Chen's innovation spread quickly through the Canadian artillery. Within days, other Bofors crews were experimenting with ground fire. The results were uniformly positive. The Bofors excelled at missions that were difficult for conventional weapons. Against fortified buildings, the rapid fire and explosive shells could quickly reduce walls to rubble. Against German positions and tree lines, the Bofors could saturate an area with explosive fire in a way that rifles and machine guns could not match. Against German vehicles, the 40mm shells could penetrate armor that was proof against smaller calibers. But the most important advantage was responsiveness. Artillery fire required calling fire missions through multiple layers of command. It required observers to adjust fire. It often took 20 to 30 minutes from the time infantry requested fire support to the time rounds landed. Bofors guns, positioned close to the front lines and controlled by officers who could see the targets, could deliver fire within seconds of a request. For infantry fighting in urban areas or close terrain, this responsiveness was invaluable. By early November 1944, Canadian artillery commanders began issuing informal guidance on Bofors ground fire. The official doctrine still designated the Bofors as anti-aircraft only. But the informal guidance acknowledged that in the absence of air threats, Bofors guns could be used in ground support roles at the discretion of battery commanders. This created an interesting command situation. Officially, Bofors guns were violating doctrine. Unofficially, they were doing exactly what their commanders wanted. The solution was to not document the practice too explicitly. After-action reports would mention artillery support without specifying what type of artillery. Ammunition expenditure reports would list Bofors rounds fired but not specify the targets engaged. This bureaucratic fiction allowed the practice to continue while protecting everyone from accusations of violating regulations. But the practice could not remain hidden indefinitely. On November 15, 1944, a British liaison officer attached to Canadian forces witnessed a Bofors gun engaging a German pillbox at point-blank range. The officer was scandalized. He filed a report with British Second Army headquarters stating that Canadian forces were misusing anti-aircraft weapons in ground roles, that this violated doctrine, and that it should be stopped immediately. The report eventually reached General Harry Crerar, commander of 1st Canadian Army. Crerar, a methodical staff officer who valued proper procedure, was in a difficult position. On one hand, the practice clearly violated established doctrine. On the other hand, it was working. Canadian casualties were declining in sectors where Bofors ground fire was being used. Infantry commanders were praising the effectiveness of Bofors support, and the alternative was to order Canadian gunners to stop using a technique that was saving Canadian lives. Crerar made a decision that revealed his pragmatic side. He authorized a formal study of Bofors ground fire effectiveness to be conducted by Canadian Artillery Headquarters. Until the study was complete, battery commanders would have discretion to use Bofors guns in ground support roles based on tactical requirements. This effectively legalized the practice while maintaining the fiction that it was still being evaluated. The study was conducted over 3 weeks in late November and early December. Artillery officers interviewed infantry commanders about the effectiveness of Bofors support. They reviewed ammunition expenditure and casualty rates. They analyzed after-action reports from dozens of engagements where Bofors guns had been used against ground targets. The conclusion was unambiguous. Bofors guns in ground support roles were highly effective. They provided rapid, accurate, devastating fire against targets that conventional artillery struggled to engage. They were particularly effective in urban combat, against fortified positions, and in situations where friendly and enemy forces were in close proximity. The study recommended that Canadian artillery formally adopt Bofors ground fire as a standard tactic and that training be developed to maximize effectiveness. Crerar approved the recommendation on December 18, 1944. The Canadian Army became the first Allied force to officially authorize the use of anti-aircraft guns in direct fire ground support roles. But authorization from headquarters was one thing, maximizing effectiveness in the field was another. Over the winter of 1944 to 45, Canadian artillery officers and Bofors crews developed techniques and tactics for ground fire that transformed the weapon from an improvisation into a system. The first challenge was aiming. The Bofors was designed to track moving aircraft in 3 dimensions. Its sighting system was complex and optimized for high-angle fire. For ground targets, this sophistication was unnecessary and actually made the gun harder to use. Canadian crews developed simplified aiming techniques. For targets beyond 500 yards, they used the anti-aircraft sight but ignored the lead calculations and simply aimed directly at the target. For closer targets, they aimed over the barrel using visual reference, similar to how a rifle is aimed. This crude technique worked because the high rate of fire allowed quick adjustment, fire a burst, observe where the rounds hit, adjust, fire again. Within 2 or 3 bursts, the crew could put rounds exactly where they wanted them. The second challenge was mobility. The Bofors was mounted on a wheeled carriage that could be towed by a truck. But in forward areas, particularly in the close terrain of Dutch towns and villages, Getting the gun into position often required manhandling it through narrow streets and over obstacles. Canadian crews developed techniques for moving the gun short distances by crew power alone. 6 men could push or pull the 2-ton weapon for 50 yards if necessary. This allowed them to position guns in locations that would have been inaccessible if they had to use vehicles. The third challenge was ammunition supply. The Bofors fired 4-round clips. Each clip weighed approximately 9 pounds. In anti-aircraft use, a gun might fire 20 to 30 rounds during an engagement with an aircraft. In ground support use, particularly when engaging fortified positions, a gun might fire 200 rounds or more. This meant that ammunition supply became critical. Canadian artillery developed a system where trucks would deliver ammunition to forward dumps, and then crews would manhandle clips forward to gun positions. In intense fighting, crews would establish human chains to pass ammunition clips from the supply point to the gun. The fourth challenge was targeting. In anti-aircraft use, targets were obvious: aircraft in the sky. In ground support use, identifying the right targets and avoiding hitting friendly forces required coordination and communication. Canadian artillery established forward observer teams specifically for Bofors guns. These teams, usually an officer and a radio operator, would position themselves where they could see the battlefield and could talk directly to Bofors crews. When infantry needed fire support, they would radio the observer, who would identify the target and direct the Bofors fire. This system worked because the observer could see both the target and the impact of the rounds, allowing real-time adjustment. By January 1945, the Canadian use of Bofors in ground roles had evolved from improvisation to doctrine. Training programs were established, manuals were written, tactics were standardized, and the weapon that had been designed to shoot down aircraft had become the Canadian infantry's favorite fire support option for close-range combat. The effectiveness of Canadian Bofors ground fire tactics became evident in several major operations in early 1945. The first was Operation Veritable, the Canadian and British offensive to clear the Reichswald forest and break through the Siegfried Line into Germany. The operation began on February 8, 1945, with the largest artillery barrage the Western Front had seen since World War I. Over 1,000 guns fired for 5 hours, saturating German positions with high explosive shells. But when the infantry advanced, they discovered that the German fortifications in the Reichswald were remarkably resilient. Concrete bunkers had survived the bombardment. German troops emerged from shelters to man machine gun positions, and the dense forest made conventional artillery observation difficult. Canadian Bofors guns proved invaluable in this environment. The guns were mobile enough to advance with the infantry through the forest trails. The crews could engage targets at close range without needing complicated fire direction. And the rapid fire of the Bofors was ideal for suppressing German positions while infantry maneuvered. One particularly dramatic engagement occurred on February 10th near the village of Cranenburg. A company of the Regina Rifle Regiment was attempting to clear German positions in a cluster of concrete bunkers. The bunkers were positioned to provide interlocking fire, making it nearly impossible to approach them without being caught in crossfire from multiple directions. The company commander requested Bofors support. 2 guns were brought forward to within 300 yards of the nearest bunker. Crews could not see the bunkers clearly through the forest, so a forward observer climbed a tree and directed fire using a radio. The observers called out corrections. Left 50 yards, down 10 yards, fire! The Bofors crews adjusted and fired. The observer watched the impact. Right 20 yards, fire for effect. The crews opened up with sustained fire. The 40mm shells, while not powerful enough to penetrate the concrete bunkers, could damage firing slits, destroy vision blocks, and make it impossible for the German crews to use their weapons. After 2 minutes of sustained fire, the observer reported that the bunkers had been suppressed. The Regina Rifles advanced and cleared the positions with grenades and flamethrowers. They discovered that while the bunkers themselves were intact, the German crews had been so battered by the Bofors fire that they offered minimal resistance. This pattern repeated throughout Operation Veritable. Bofors guns would suppress German strong points, infantry would close the distance, and positions would be cleared at minimal cost. By the end of the operation, Canadian infantry commanders were requesting Bofors support by preference over conventional artillery for any target closer than 1,000 yards. The second major demonstration of Bofors effectiveness came during the liberation of Dutch cities in April 1945. The Germans, retreating toward Germany, had established strong defensive positions in several Dutch cities. These positions were typically centered on large stone buildings, churches, town halls, and factories that provided excellent cover and fields of fire. Conventional artillery could destroy these buildings, but doing so would cause massive civilian casualties and destroy historic structures. The Canadians needed a more precise method of neutralizing German positions without leveling entire neighborhoods. Bofors guns provided the solution. The guns could be positioned within a few hundred yards of German-held buildings. The crews could aim at specific windows or sections of wall where German weapons were positioned. The 40mm shells could penetrate walls and explode inside rooms, eliminating German fighting positions while leaving the overall structure mostly intact. On April 13th, during the liberation of Arnhem, this technique was used to clear German positions in the city's historic church. The Germans had positioned machine guns in the church tower, giving them excellent observation and fields of fire over the approaches to the city center. Destroying the tower with artillery would have meant destroying a landmark that had stood for 400 years. Instead, 2 Bofors guns were positioned in buildings facing the tower. The crews aimed at the tower windows and fired 20 rounds each. The explosive shells eliminated the German positions while causing relatively minor damage to the tower structure itself. Dutch civilians, watching the Schieber liberation, were amazed by the precision. They had expected the Canadians to level the city as American forces had done in other urban battles. Instead, the Canadians were systematically eliminating German positions with minimal collateral damage. The final major use of Canadian Bofors tactics came during the crossing of the Rhine in March and April 1945. The Rhine was the last major obstacle before Allied forces could penetrate into the heart of Germany. The Germans defended the river crossings with everything they had, including extensive fortifications on the eastern bank. Canadian engineers, preparing to throw bridges across the Rhine, needed suppressive fire that could keep German positions from interfering with the vulnerable bridging operations. Conventional artillery was too slow and imprecise. Direct fire from tanks was limited by the range and availability of armor. Bofors guns proved to be the ideal solution. Canadian artillery positioned dozens of Bofors guns along the western bank of the Rhine. These guns could fire across the river, suppressing German positions on the eastern bank while engineers worked. The rapid fire of the Bofors meant that German positions would be continuously engaged, unable to effectively target the bridges being constructed. On March 24th, during the main Rhine crossing operation, over 60 Bofors guns provided direct fire support. They fired over 30,000 rounds in 6 hours, an average of 500 rounds per gun. German defenders reported that the Bofors fire made it impossible to man defensive positions effectively. The crossing succeeded with relatively light casualties. Canadian engineers later stated that without the Bofors suppressive fire, the casualties would have been much higher. The success of Canadian Bofors tactics did not go unnoticed by other Allied forces. By spring 1945, British and American units were beginning to adopt similar techniques. But the Canadians remained the most proficient users of the weapon in the ground support role. This proficiency was partly due to experience. Canadian forces had been using Bofors ground fire for 6 months by the time other forces began experimenting with it. But it was also due to doctrine. The Canadians had developed training, tactics, and organizational structures specifically for Bofors ground fire. Other forces were still treating it as an improvisation. There were also differences in how the weapon was employed. American forces, when they used Bofors against ground targets, typically employed them in massed batteries of 4 to 6 guns firing coordinated barrages. This approach maximized firepower but required more planning and coordination. Canadian forces often employed Bofors guns singly or in pairs, positioned close to the front lines and responding directly to infantry requests for support. This approach was more flexible and responsive, but required well-trained crews and forward observers. British forces, always more conservative about departing from doctrine, used Bofors ground fire primarily in defensive situations, suppressing German counterattacks or providing covering fire during withdrawals. The Canadians used them offensively as integral parts of assault operations. These differences reflected broader cultural differences in how the 3 main Western allies approached warfare. The Americans emphasized mass and firepower. The British emphasized careful planning and adherence to doctrine. The Canadians, fighting with limited resources and often given the most difficult missions, emphasized flexibility and improvisation. The Bofors ground fire innovation was characteristically Canadian in this respect. It was a solution born from necessity, developed through experimentation, and implemented through practical-minded commanders willing to ignore regulations that did not match battlefield realities. After the war, military theorists and historians studied the Canadian use of the Bofors as an example of tactical innovation. Several lessons emerged from this analysis. The first lesson was about weapon versatility. Most weapons are designed for specific roles, and military doctrine tends to reinforce those designed roles. But weapons often have capabilities beyond their primary design purpose. Soldiers who can recognize and exploit those secondary capabilities gain tactical advantages. The Bofors was designed as an anti-aircraft gun, but its high rate of fire, explosive ammunition, and mobility also made it an excellent direct-fire weapon against ground targets. This should have been obvious from the specifications alone, but it took soldiers facing real tactical problems to recognize and exploit it. The second lesson was about the importance of decentralized command. The Bofors ground fire innovation did not come from headquarters. It came from lieutenants and corporals at the front lines who had the authority to experiment and the judgment to recognize what worked. If Canadian artillery had rigidly enforced anti-aircraft doctrine, if battery commanders had prohibited ground fire until it was officially authorized, the innovation would never have happened. The Canadian military culture that allowed junior officers to improvise and that protected them when they violated regulations for good tactical reasons was essential to the innovation. The third lesson was about the relationship between doctrine and reality. Doctrine is necessary. It provides standardized procedures that allow large organizations to function effectively. But doctrine must be flexible enough to accommodate battlefield realities. When the Luftwaffe disappeared from the skies over Northwest Europe, anti-aircraft doctrine became obsolete. Forces that recognized this and adapted thrived. Forces that continued to follow obsolete doctrine wasted resources. The fourth lesson was about the value of combined arms integration. The Bofors ground fire technique worked because it was integrated into a larger system involving infantry, forward observers, ammunition supply, and command coordination. The weapon alone was not revolutionary, but the system built around the weapon, using it as one element in a comprehensive approach to close support, was highly effective. These lessons, learned from Canadian innovation with the Bofors gun, influenced post-war military thinking. The concept of using anti-aircraft weapons in ground roles became standard practice. Modern armies routinely train crews to engage both air and ground targets. The organizational structures developed by the Canadians, particularly the forward observer teams and the flexible command arrangements, became models for close air support and artillery coordination. And the broader lesson about the need for tactical flexibility and the importance of allowing junior leaders to innovate became central to Western military doctrine during the Cold War. In Canada itself, the Bofors innovation became a source of quiet pride. Canadian military culture has always valued practicality over theory, results over regulations. The Bofors story exemplified these values. Canadian soldiers faced a problem. They looked at the tools available. They asked not what the manual said, but what would work. And they saved lives by thinking differently. This story, while not as dramatic as the great battles or famous generals, captured something essential about how Canadians approached warfare. Not with overwhelming resources or brilliant strategy, but with clever use of what they had and a willingness to try things that more conventional minds would have rejected. Today, the Bofors 40mm gun is obsolete. Modern armies use missiles and radar-guided guns for anti-aircraft defense. The weapon that Canadian soldiers turned into a devastating ground support tool has been replaced by systems that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944. But the principle that Canadian soldiers demonstrated with the Bofors remains relevant. Weapons are tools. Tools can be used in ways their designers never imagined, and soldiers who understand this, who can look at the equipment they have and see possibilities rather than limitations, will always have an advantage over enemies who cannot. The story of Canada's unusual use of the Bofors 40mm in World War II is ultimately a story about human creativity under pressure. Corporal MacDonald in the Scheldt, Lieutenant Chen at Woensdrecht, and hundreds of other Canadian gunners whose names are lost to history all faced the same problem. How do we support our infantry when conventional weapons cannot reach the enemy? The answer they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Use the guns we have in ways they were not designed for. Ignore the manual, focus on what works, and save lives by thinking differently. That is the lesson of the Bofors. That is the Canadian approach to warfare. And That is why, 80 years later, military historians still study what happened when Canadian soldiers looked at an anti-aircraft gun and asked, "What else can we do with this?" The answer changed how wars are fought, and it saved the lives of thousands of Canadian soldiers who would have died assaulting positions that the Bofors could destroy. That is innovation. That is necessity as the mother of invention. That is Canada's unusual use of the Bofors 40mm gun in World War II.